I had just had open heart surgery. I was alone in a hospital gown, 3 hours from home, and I texted my family, "Can someone pick me up?" My daughter-in-law wrote back, "We're busy." My son added, "Why don't you ever plan ahead?" I typed one word, "Okay," and closed my phone. A few hours later, it lit up with 48 missed calls. Here's what happened in between. I am 60 years old. And 3 days after a surgeon opened my chest and repaired a blocked artery, that could have killed me. I learned that okay can be the most powerful word in the English language, if you say it and mean it fully. My name is Marilyn Hayes. My husband, Thomas, died 9 years ago, a sudden aneurysm that took him from me on an otherwise ordinary Saturday morning, and in the years since I have built a quiet, steady life on my own in a small house outside Columbus, Ohio, close enough to my son Brandon that I could see him regularly, far enough that I never wanted to feel like a burden underfoot in his own household. Brandon is 33, married for 5 years to a woman named Courtney. And together they have 2 children, my grandchildren, Maya and Wesley, 7 and 4, the 2 people in this entire story I love without a single complicated feeling attached to that love. Hod. I want to be honest about the years leading up to this story, because I think the context matters enormously. Since Thomas died, I have been, in more ways than either Brandon or Courtney has ever fully acknowledged, a significant source of support for their household. I watched Maya and Wesley 2 full days a week for the first 4 years of Maya's life, unpaid gladly, because that is what grandmothers do. I co-signed the loan on their first house 5 years ago, when Brandon's credit wasn't yet strong enough to qualify on his own. I have quietly transferred money into their account more times than I can easily count. Never enormous sums, but steady, consistent help. Birthday money that somehow always ended up covering a car repair, holiday gifts that somehow always ended up as school clothes for the kids instead. I did all of this without complaint, without keeping score. Because I genuinely believed that this was simply what family meant. In February, I was diagnosed with significant coronary artery disease during a routine cardiac workup, prompted by some chest tightness I'd been quietly ignoring for months. My cardiologist here in Columbus referred me to the Cleveland Clinic for a specialized bypass procedure, given the specific complexity of the blockage. Which meant a nearly 3-hour drive from home for both the surgery itself and the recovery period that followed. I drove myself to Cleveland the day before the surgery, alone, because Brandon had a work commitment he said he couldn't move. And Courtney had the children's school schedules to manage. I told myself this was reasonable. I told myself the way I have told myself so many things over the past 9 years, that family logistics are complicated, that everyone has genuine obligations, that my needs simply had to fit around the edges of everyone else's busier, fuller lives. The surgery itself went well. A triple bypass, successful by every edge my sword surgical toy oft boardwood. Though the recovery, as anyone who has been through open heart surgery will tell you, is its own separate ordeal entirely. I spent 4 days in the hospital in Cleveland, groggy, sore in a way that made even breathing feel like an effort. Watched over by kind, competent nurses who checked on me more consistently than any member of my own family managed to call. Brandon texted twice during those 4 days. Courtney texted once, a brief thinking of you, with a heart emoji that felt, even through the fog of pain medication, oddly weightless. Neither of them visited, though I understood, even then, that a 3-hour drive with 2 young children was a genuinely significant undertaking. And I did not begrudge them that specific absence, not fully, not yet. The discharge came on a Thursday morning, 4 days after surgery. My surgical team was clear and specific about the restrictions. No driving for at least 2 weeks. Given both the medication I was on and the physical strain the procedure had placed on my body. Someone needed to be with me for the first 24 to 48 hours at minimum, in case of complications, and any significant physical exertion, including the stress of navigating an unfamiliar hospital discharge process alone, carried real risk that my surgical team took seriously enough to mention multiple times before releasing me. I sat in my hospital bed that Thursday morning, still at monitors that would be removed within the hour, and opened the family group chat, a text thread that included Brandon, Courtney, and me. Used mostly for coordinating grandchildren pickups and holiday plans, and typed a message I had been quietly dreading having to send, because some part of me already suspected with a clarity I didn't yet want to fully acknowledge. How it might be received. Getting discharged today. Doctor says I shouldn't drive for 2 weeks and really shouldn't be alone for the first day or two. Can someone come pick me up from Cleveland? I know it's a big ask, but I don't have anyone else to call. I sat with my phone in my lap for nearly 20 minutes before the first response came. It was Courtney. Oh no, that's rough timing. We're super busy this week, honestly. Wesley has his dentist appointment tomorrow, and Maya's got her recital Saturday, and with Brandon's work schedule, it's just really not a good week for a Cleveland trip. We're kind of slammed. I stared at that message for a long moment, feeling something in my chest tighten that had nothing to do with the incisions still healing beneath my hospital gown. I typed back, carefully, trying to keep the hurt out of the words, even though I could feel it rising in my throat. I understand things are busy. I really don't have anyone else who can make this trip, though. Is there any way one of you could manage even a few hours? Brandon's response came a few minutes later, and it is the specific wording of what he said that I don't think I will ever fully stop hearing when I close my eyes and think about that morning. Mom, why don't you ever plan ahead for this stuff? You knew this surgery was scheduled for weeks. You could have arranged a ride service or asked a friend well in advance instead of texting us the morning of, expecting us to drop everything. I read that message 3 times. Just sitting alone in a hospital bed, 3 hours from home, with my chest still wrapped in surgical dressing, my body still recovering from having been cracked open and repaired 4 days earlier. And I felt something inside me go very quiet and very still, not the hot, immediate anger I might have expected, but something colder, clearer, more final. I typed one word back to the group chat. Okay. And then I closed my phone, set it face down on the hospital tray table, and sat with that single word for a long moment, understanding with a clarity that surprised even me, given the exhaustion and pain medication still working through my system. That something fundamental in how I understood my relationship with my son had just permanently shifted.
I want to explain what happened over the following several hours, because I think the specific sequence of events matters for understanding everything that followed. A nurse named Yolanda, who had cared for me throughout my hospital stay, with a warmth I will genuinely never forget, came into my room shortly after I'd set my phone down, and must have seen something in my face that told her the family logistics had not resolved themselves the way she'd hoped when she'd asked about them that morning. "Mrs. Hayes, everything all right with your ride situation?" I told her. Honestly, what had just happened? Yolanda's face shifted into something between sympathy and quiet professional concern. "Okay, let's figure this out properly then," she said. "We're not discharging you into a situation where you're navigating this completely alone with no support plan. Let me talk to the discharge coordinator." Over the following 2 hours, with Yolanda's help, I arranged something I had genuinely never expected to need at 60 years old. A private medical transport service, the kind typically used for patients who need more careful handling than a standard rideshare can offer. Staffed by someone trained to monitor a post-surgical patient during transport. It cost $340, a sum I paid without hesitation. Though the specific sting of that number, the actual dollar cost of my own son's unwillingness to make a 3-hour drive, stayed with me long after the transaction cleared. I also arranged, through a home health referral the hospital's social worker provided, a visiting nurse to check on me for the first 2 nights at home, someone who could monitor my vitals, help with basic tasks, and ensure I wasn't navigating those critical first hours of recovery entirely alone, exactly as my surgical team had specifically warned against. I arrived home in Columbus around 4 in the afternoon, exhausted in a way that went far beyond the physical toll of the surgery itself, settled into my own bed with the visiting nurse's help, and spent the remainder of that day in the particular quiet that follows a genuinely painful realization. Not crying, though I expected I might, but simply sitting with a clarity that felt, strangely, more like relief than grief. I did not respond further to the group chat that day. I did not call Brandon to express my hurt, did not send a longer message explaining exactly how his words had landed. It did not do any of the things that 9 years of quietly accommodating my family's priorities might have once led me to do. I simply let my single word, "okay," stand as my entire response. and turned my attention instead to something that had been quietly forming in my mind throughout that long, difficult day. A full, honest accounting of exactly how much of my life, in ways both large and small, had been organized around supporting a family that had just demonstrated, with painful clarity, exactly where my own well-being ranked among their priorities. That evening, once the visiting nurse had left for the night and I was settled, alone but safely monitored through a call check system she'd arranged, I did something I had been putting off for longer than I wanted to admit to myself. I called my attorney, a thoughtful, careful man named Gregory Talbot, who had handled my affairs since Thomas passed away 9 years earlier. "Marilyn," he said, once I'd explained what had happened, "I want to make sure I understand the full picture here before we talk about any changes. Walk me through exactly what kind of financial support you've been providing." I laid it out for him, honestly, in a way I don't think I had ever fully laid out even for myself before that moment. The co-signed mortgage loan, still carrying my name as a guarantor 5 years after Brandon and Courtney had purchased their home. The recurring, informal transfers of money that had become, over 9 years, a kind of unacknowledged monthly allowance neither of us had ever formally named as such. The substantial life insurance policy from Thomas's passing that I had years earlier designated Brandon as sole beneficiary of, along with my full estate, structured with the same unexamined assumption of unconditional loyalty that had shaped so many of my decisions since becoming a widow. "Here's what I want you to sit with tonight," Gregory said carefully, once I'd finished. "None of what happened today is something you need to decide how to respond to immediately. But I think it's worth understanding clearly exactly how much financial vulnerability you've built into your relationship with your son, largely without either of you ever fully acknowledging it as vulnerability. That co-signed loan, in particular, means you remain financially exposed if anything ever went wrong with their mortgage payments, regardless of how this relationship evolves from here." "What would you recommend?" I asked. "I'd recommend we start tomorrow with a full review of everything, the loan guarantee, the beneficiary designations, the pattern of transfers. Not necessarily to change everything immediately, but to understand exactly what options you actually have, so that whatever you decide to do next comes from a position of clarity rather than raw hurt. Does that feel reasonable?" It did, and we scheduled a full meeting for the following week, once I'd had more time to recover physically from the surgery itself. But I want to be honest about something that happened that same evening. Something that set in motion the specific sequence of events that would lead to that eventual barrage of missed calls. Because the mortgage payment for Brandon and Courtney's house was due on the 15th of every month, and because I had, for the preceding 5 years, maintained a standing arrangement, one I had set up myself, out of a desire to be helpful, to be a safety net, to ensure the payment always cleared even during the occasional months when Brandon's freelance consulting income ran tight, of covering any shortfall directly from my own account before the automatic payment processed. A quiet arrangement neither Brandon nor Courtney had ever needed to think about because it had simply, invisibly, always worked. Sitting in my bed that evening, still processing the events of the day, I logged into my banking app and cancelled that standing arrangement entirely. I did not do this out of a desire for immediate consequence or punishment, not exactly. I did it because Gregory's words had crystallized something important. I had spent 9 years quietly protecting my son and his family from the natural consequences of their own financial choices. An invisible safety net they had apparently come to depend on so completely that they'd never once needed to acknowledge its existence, let alone thank me for maintaining it. If Brandon could not find within himself the basic willingness to drive 3 hours to help his own mother recover from open-heart surgery, I no longer felt any particular obligation to continue quietly protecting him from a financial shortfall he had never once, in 5 years, thanked me for covering. I closed the banking app, set my phone aside, and slept more soundly that night than I had expected, given everything my body and heart had endured over the preceding 4 days.
I want to explain the timing of what happened next, because I think it matters for understanding the specific shape of this story's climax. The mortgage payment I had quietly covered for 5 years processed on the 15th of the month, which happened to fall exactly 9 days after I had cancelled the standing arrangement. Giving Brandon and Courtney's own account 9 full days during which the safety net I had always silently provided simply was not there, invisible until its absence suddenly, sharply was not. I learned later, through the eventual conversation that followed, exactly what had happened on their end. The mortgage payment attempted to process against an account that, without my quiet supplementary transfer, did not hold sufficient funds, triggering both a returned payment fee from their bank and an overdraft on 2 smaller automatic payments that had been scheduled around the same date, assuming, as they always had, that the account would hold the buffer it had silently held for 5 uninterrupted years. My phone began ringing at 7:42 in the morning, 9 days after I had returned home from Cleveland, still recovering, still moving carefully through each day with the particular deliberateness that heart surgery recovery requires. I did not answer the first call. I had, by that point, made a quiet decision to let Brandon's calls go to voicemail for at least the first day, not out of spite, but because I genuinely needed the physical and emotional space to process whatever was about to unfold without doing so in a state of immediate reactive crisis. By the time I finally checked my phone around noon that day, feeling well enough to sit up and manage a light lunch, I found 48 missed calls waiting for me. The overwhelming majority from Brandon, several from Courtney, one oddly from a number I didn't recognize that turned out, upon calling back days later out of simple curiosity, to be their mortgage lender's automated collections line, I also found a string of increasingly frantic text messages, which I will summarize rather than reproduce in full, because their emotional arc mattered more than their specific wording. Initial confusion about the returned payment, followed by growing alarm as Brandon apparently realized the automatic system that had quietly protected their account for years had simply, without warning, stopped functioning, followed finally, several hours in, by a message that read, in its entirety, "Mom, I think something's wrong with our account. Can you call me as soon as you see this? It's pretty urgent." I sat with my lunch, reading through this escalating sequence of messages, and felt, I will admit, a complicated mixture of emotions I had not fully anticipated. Part of me felt a grim, uncomfortable satisfaction at watching my son experience in real time a small taste of the precariousness I had quietly absorbed on his behalf for years without acknowledgment, but a larger part of me felt something closer to sadness. Sadness that it had taken a bounced mortgage payment, rather than genuine reflection on his own behavior, to finally prompt this level of urgent attention toward me. I called him back that afternoon, once I felt emotionally and physically steady enough to have the conversation clearly. "Mom, thank God, I've been trying to reach you all day. Something happened with our mortgage payment. It bounced and now we've got fees piling up, and I don't understand what happened. It's always just worked automatically for years." I cancelled the arrangement I had in place, I said simply. There was a long pause on the line. "What arrangement?" "Brandon," I said, keeping my voice level. The same steadiness I had cultivated sitting alone in that Cleveland hospital bed 9 days earlier. "For the past 5 years, I have covered any shortfall in your mortgage payment before it processed each month, quietly, without either you or Courtney ever needing to think about it. I did this because I love you, and because I wanted to help ensure you never fell behind on your home. I cancelled that arrangement 9 days ago." The evening after I came home alone from open heart surgery because neither you nor Courtney could find 3 hours to help me. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I genuinely wondered if the call had dropped. "Mom," he finally said, his voice smaller than I had heard it in years, "I had no idea you were doing that. 5 years, and I genuinely had no idea." "I know you didn't," I said. "That was in some ways exactly the problem. I made it so easy for you to never have to think about it, never have to acknowledge it, never have to thank me for it, that it simply became invisible. The way I think. A lot of what I've quietly done for this family over the past 9 years has become invisible to you. And then, the one time I actually needed something back, something as simple as a ride home after major surgery, the answer I got was that I hadn't planned ahead well enough." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something I hadn't heard from him in a very long time, genuine, unguarded shame. Mom, I don't know what to say. I think I've been taking so much for granted for so long that I stopped even seeing it as something you were actively choosing to give us, over and over. It just felt like it was always just there. And then when you actually needed something, I made you feel like asking for help was some kind of failure on your part, instead of understanding that you'd been quietly helping us in ways I never even noticed for years. I need you to sit with that, I said. Not apologize quickly and move past it, the way I think we've both gotten used to doing with difficult things in this family. I need you to actually understand what it felt like, lying in that hospital bed 4 days after surgeons opened my chest. Being told by my own son that I hadn't planned ahead well enough for the two of you to make time for me.
It has been 8 months now since that morning of 48 missed calls, and I want to tell this part of the story honestly, because I think it deserves an honest accounting rather than a simple satisfying resolution. I did not restore the mortgage safety net arrangement. This was, I want to be clear, not a punitive decision maintained out of lingering anger, but a considered one, made with Gregory's careful guidance over the following weeks. Brandon and Courtney needed to understand and manage their own household finances directly, without an invisible cushion silently protecting them from the natural consequences of their own budgeting choices. It took them several difficult months to fully stabilize their finances without that quiet support. They refinanced a portion of their debt. Courtney picked up additional freelance work. Brandon, notably, finally had a frank conversation with his employer about a raise he'd been avoiding asking for out of what he later admitted was simple conflict avoidance. But they did stabilize on their own footing, in a way that I believe has ultimately left them both more genuinely capable and more genuinely appreciative of what financial security actually requires. I also worked with Gregory to remove myself as a guarantor on their mortgage entirely. Once their finances had stabilized enough to qualify for a straightforward refinance under Brandon's name alone, a process that took nearly 5 months, but that I consider one of the most important boundaries I have set for myself in the entirety of my adult life. I did not change my will or Brandon's status as my primary beneficiary ultimately. I want to be honest that I seriously considered it, in the raw early weeks following my return from Cleveland. But as the months passed and I watched Brandon genuinely reckon with what had happened, not through a single dramatic conversation, but through a sustained pattern of changed behavior that has, slowly, rebuilt something real between us, I came to believe that punitive financial decisions made in the heat of justified hurt would ultimately serve my own peace less well than watching my son actually grow into someone worth trusting with what Thomas and I built together over our own 32 years of marriage. Brandon has visited every single week since that phone call, often bringing Maya and Wesley, sometimes coming alone specifically to help with things around my house that I genuinely do still need help with as I continue recovering my full strength. Courtney, for her part, called me directly about 6 weeks after the initial incident. An honest, difficult conversation in which she acknowledged, without excuse-making, that her initial response in that group chat had reflected a broader pattern of treating my needs as less urgent than her own family's daily logistics. A pattern she told me she was actively working to examine and change. I am 60 years old. I built a family, buried a husband 9 years ago. Quietly supported my son's household in ways both large and small for the better part of a decade without ever fully naming what I was doing even to myself. And then, lying alone in a hospital bed 3 hours from home, 4 days after surgeons repaired my own failing heart, I learned exactly how invisible that support had become to the people who benefited most from it. People sometimes ask me if I regret cancelling that mortgage arrangement so abruptly, without warning, in the raw emotional aftermath of that painful day. I tell them the truth. I do not regret it, though I understand now, with the clarity that 8 months of reflection provides, that it was never really about the money itself. It was about finally, after 9 years, insisting that my own needs be treated as real, as worthy of the same effort and priority I had quietly extended to my family for so long without ever once asking for acknowledgement in return. 48 missed calls. That is what it took for my son to finally understand exactly how much quiet, unacknowledged love had been holding up the ordinary architecture of his daily life. I am grateful, in the end, that he chose to actually hear what those missed calls were truly about, rather than simply resenting the inconvenience of having finally had to notice.